Well, let us turn in our Bibles to the book of Genesis and chapter 46. The book of Genesis and chapter 46. And there can be some situations in life where it's harder to believe good news than it is to believe bad news. For example, you go to the dentist for a checkup, dreading to think what the outcome might be, only to hear the dentist say, all clear, see you in 6 months' time. And as you leave the premises, you can hardly believe it. Or you put your car in for an MOT, expecting a list of faults and failures the length of your arm, only to be told when you pick it up that it's passed for another year. And as you drive back home, you're baffled as to how that can possibly be true. Situations in life where it's harder to believe good news than it is to believe bad news. And that is the situation that Jacob finds himself in at the close of Genesis 45. His 11 sons have returned from Egypt with the news, verse 26, Joseph is still alive. In fact, he is ruler of all Egypt. And we are told in the second half of that verse, Jacob was stunned. He did not believe them. And the reason he did not believe them is because he has lived the past 22 years of his life believing that Joseph was dead. To now be told that he is alive, it may be good news, all right, but it's news that is simply too good to be true, as far as Jacob is concerned. That is, until he looks outside the front door and sees what's sitting on the driveway. Did you notice what it was that made him change? What it was that made him believe the good news, verse 27. But when they told him everything Joseph had said to them, and when he saw the carts that Joseph had sent to carry him back. Did you hear that? When he saw the carts. Back in verse 19, we read of Pharaoh telling Joseph to give some carts to his brothers. And although we are not told what the carts were like, they must have been quite impressive to convince Jacob of his son's reports. Perhaps they were the equivalent of Buckingham Palace top of the range Range Rovers. Alistair Begg suggests that it was because the steering wheels was on the opposite side from a Canaanite cart. That was what persuaded Joseph. A great sense of humour he has. But whatever it was enough to persuade Jacob. And so we hear him say, verse 28, I'm convinced my son Joseph is still alive. I will go and see him before I die. And as he sets off on his journey, we learn a number of things. We see a number of things, the first being in verses 1 to 4. And there we have a sufficient reassurance from God. A sufficient reassurance from God. Now, as you read Old Testament history, you sometimes come across the phrase from Dan to Beersheba. And that is the same as us saying from John O'Groats to Land's End, because Dan was at the northern end of the promised land and Beersheba was at the southern end. And so it's just as Jacob was about to leave Canaan and cross into Egypt that we read of him stopping and offering sacrifices to the God of his father Isaac. And the reason we are told that the sacrifices are being offered to the God of his father Isaac is not only to tell us that he's worshipping the same God as his father did, but also to remind us that God had appeared to his father at this very same place. In chapter 26, verse 23, we read of God appearing to Isaac at Beersheba and reassuring him of his presence. And Jacob desperately needs that same reassurance. Because leaving the land of Canaan for Egypt was no small thing or no easy thing for this man to do. Yes, on the one hand, he's desperate to see his long-lost son. And so you think, what's the problem, Jacob? Get down there as soon as you can. But on the other hand, he no doubt is thinking and remembers that it's Canaan that is the land of promise. He was perhaps also aware that in a time of famine, his father Isaac had been told by God not to go down to Egypt, chapter 26, verse 2. And he perhaps also was aware that when his grandfather Abraham had gone down to Egypt in chapter 12, it didn't go all that well. And so Jacob probably had mixed feelings about going down to Egypt. And it was within that context of mixed feelings, fear and doubt and uncertainty, that we read in verse 2 that God spoke to Israel in a vision at night and said, Jacob, Jacob, I am God, the God of your father. Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for I will make you into a great nation there. I will go down to Egypt with you, and I will surely bring you back again. And Joseph's own hand will close your eyes. Now, if you were with us last week, then you may remember that we heard in chapter 45 Joseph's testimony to the sovereign providential overruling of God in his life. For example, chapter 45, verse 5, God sent me ahead of you. Verse 8, God made me father of Pharaoh, lord of his entire household, and ruler of all Egypt. And when you think that Pharaoh was the most powerful man on the planet at that time, Joseph's testimony presents us with a very high view of God. A view of God in his transcendence. In other words, he's a God who's far above his creation and ruling over his creation. So much so that, as I quoted last week from the book of Proverbs, the king's heart is in the hand of the Lord. He directs it like a watercourse wherever he pleases. Or as the prophet Isaiah reminds us in chapter 40 of his prophecy, he sits enthroned above the circle of the earth, and its people are like grasshoppers. He brings princes to naught and reduces the rulers of this world to nothing. What a big and glorious and transcendent God. And yet what we have in these opening verses of chapter 46 is this very same God coming down and meeting with and engaging with a mere mortal like Jacob. Although he is a transcendent God, that does not mean that he is distant or remote or aloof from his creation. Transcendence does not mean that he is uninterested or uninvolved with his creation. Far from it. Here we have an occasion where he stoops down to speak to one of his creation, Jacob. And did you hear what he said to him? Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt. I will go down to Egypt with you. It's words that could just as easily have appeared in a parent's conversation with a young child, is it not? Can you imagine a young child going somewhere for the very first time? Perhaps to school, or the dentist, or on the bus to the next town, or perhaps on a summer camp. I'm sure many of us can remember those firsts, either in our own lives or in the lives of our children or grandchildren. And we were full of fear and doubt and anxiety, were we not? And what did our parents do in such situations? What have we done as parents and grandparents in such situations? They sat us down on their knees and they reassured us that there was no need to be afraid, especially as they would be coming with us. What a reassurance. and to be provided with that reassurance as children. It made all the difference, did it not? Of course it did. And if that reassurance from a parent or grandparent made all the difference in our experience, can you imagine the difference this reassurance made in Jacob's experience? Especially when you consider that this reassurance on this occasion is coming not from a parent or a grandparent, but from the eternal and transcendent God. Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt. I will go down to Egypt with you. What greater reassurance could Jacob possibly want? That, I'm sure, was a sufficient reassurance from God as far as Jacob was concerned. And the great news tonight is that if we are a Christian, then we too have been given the very same reassurance as we seek to live for God in this world. Do you remember what Jesus said to his disciples on the night before he went to the cross in that passage we read earlier from John chapter 15? If ever a group of believing people were in need of reassurance, it was those guys, the night before the cross. And here is what Jesus said to them. I will ask the Father, and he will give you another counselor to be with you forever. The Spirit of truth. The world cannot accept him because it neither sees him nor knows him, but you know him, for he lives with you and will be in you. I will not leave you as orphans. I will come to you. And a little later, Jesus said, peace I leave with you, my peace I give you. I do not give to you as the world gives. Do not let your hearts be troubled, and do not be afraid. In spite of all the fears and doubts and uncertainties they faced, Jesus is reassuring them that having the Holy Spirit of God with them and within them, there was no need for them to be afraid as they were going to go out and live for Jesus in this world. And many years later, and that very same Spirit of God still indwells us. And therefore many years later, and those very same words still provide us with that very same reassurance. And that is, do not let your hearts be troubled, and do not be afraid. The tremendous reassurance that Jacob received as he was about to step across the border into Egypt is the very same reassurance that you and I have as the believing people of God tonight. And that is the reassurance of his presence with us. A sufficient reassurance from God. Secondly, verses 5 to 27, and there we see an important lesson from God. An important lesson from God. Now, having received his reassurance from God, Jacob leaves Beersheba in verse 5 and heads south for Egypt. Can you picture the scene in verse 5? Jacob, his sons, their wives, their children, their livestock and their possessions, trundling along the desert road on the top of the range, Egyptian carts that Pharaoh had provided for the journey. It must have been quite a sight to see. And what we have in verses 8 to 25 is a roll call of everyone who made the journey. Well, that's not strictly true, because if you look at verse 12, you will see that some of the names that are mentioned have already died, and Onan in particular. Others mentioned in verse 12 may not yet have been born, such as Hezro and Hamel. And Benjamin's 10 sons listed in verse 21 are probably not all born yet, while others still who are mentioned are already down in Egypt, as verse 20 indicates. And so it's not strictly speaking a roll call, but it's more of a genealogy of Jacob's descendants, bringing us to the conclusion in verse 27 that the members of Jacob's family which went to Egypt were 70 in all. And by today's standards, 70 is quite a big family, is it not? But please note, it is still classified as a family or as a household in some translations. It is a family that is going into Egypt, whereas verse 3, it will be a nation that comes out of Egypt. It was way back in chapter 12 that God had promised Abraham that he and his descendants would become a great nation. 2 generations have passed, and God is reiterating that promise again. The surprising thing, however, is that God is now saying in verse 3, God is now saying that it will be down there in Egypt that he will make them into a great nation. Isn't that interesting? In view of the fact that Canaan was the promised land, one would have thought that it would have been in Canaan that God would have transformed these people from a family into a great nation. After all, surely the conditions for growth would have been more favourable in Canaan than in Egypt, would they not? Well, at this moment in time, the obvious answer to that question is no, because of the famine. If they hang around in Canaan much longer, then they may very well become extinct rather than become a great nation. But surely there is another reason. There is a bigger reason for God taking this family down to Egypt rather than just survive in the immediate family. And the reason I say that, the reason we ought to look for a bigger reason, the reason I say that is because this famine is only going to last another 5 years. Whereas God has already indicated that their stay in Egypt will be much longer than 5 years. Do you remember what God said to Abraham back in chapter 15, verse 13? Know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and they will be enslaved and ill-treated 400 years. 400 years. But I will punish the nation they serve as slaves, and afterwards they will come out with great possessions. And so God's plan is for these people to spend the next 400 years in Egypt, much of which will be spent in cruel and miserable bondage. And at the end of the 400 years, they will be miraculously rescued or redeemed from their captivity. And it is in that way that they will become the great nation that God intended them to be. But why, you may be thinking to yourself, why is God doing it that way? Surely there must have been an easier way for them to become a great nation. Couldn't they just have survived the next 5 years in Egypt, returned immediately to Canaan, and become a great nation within the comforts of their own land? Isn't God just being awkward? No, he isn't being awkward. Instead, he's demonstrating right at the very commencement of our history as the people of God, he's demonstrating a fundamental principle. And that is that it is only through redemption that God's chosen people can become the people that he intends them to be. Redemption. Redemption is the deliverance of captives through the payment of a price. And that is why God is sending his people down to Egypt, in order that he might rescue them and redeem them from captivity through the payment of a price. And by the time you get to Exodus chapter 12, you will see how the redemption of these people was accomplished. It was accomplished through the death of a sacrificial lamb who died in their place. And it was only in that way that the Israelites could be rescued from their captivity. It was only in that way that the family in Genesis 46 could become the great nation that God intended them to be. And did you know that this fundamental principle that God is establishing here in the book of Genesis, the need for redemption, that principle is one that has remained throughout our history as the people of God. That is why the Bible not only speaks about God choosing a people for himself before the creation of the world, but it's why the Bible also speaks at the same time about a lamb being chosen before the creation of the world, that lamb being Jesus Christ. And the reason he was chosen by God to be that sacrificial lamb away back then is because, as in the case of this family, it is only through redemption that God's chosen people could ever become the people that he intends them to be. Whereas the descendants of Jacob were slaves to Egyptian slave masters, you and I were slaves to sin and to Satan. Jesus once said that everyone who sins is a slave to sin. But what Jesus also said was that he had come to give his life as a ransom for many. And through the rescuing and redeeming work of Jesus Christ upon the cross, all those who trust in him are rescued and delivered from the enslaving power of sin and of Satan. And having redeemed them from their captivity through the sacrificial death of his Son, God continues to work in their experience by his Spirit, gradually but persistently, transforming them until they become the ransomed and redeemed and Christ-like people that he intends them to be. As Peter says to first-century Christians like us, he says, you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people belonging to God, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light. Once you were not a people, but now you are the people of God. If you're a Christian tonight, then that is your privileged position in the sight of God. But don't ever forget that for you and I to become that holy nation that Peter talks about, it was necessary, as Peter reminds us in the previous chapter, it was necessary for us to be redeemed from the empty way of life handed down to us from our forefathers. Redeemed, says Peter, not with perishable things such as silver or gold, but with the precious blood of Christ, a lamb without blemish or defect, chosen before the creation of the world, but revealed in these last times for your sake. And so, as you see in the experience of Jacob's descendants, it is only through redemption from captivity. It is only through redemption that we, as the chosen people of God, could ever become the people, could ever become the holy nation that God intends us to be. That is an important lesson from God. Thirdly, finally, a gracious provision from God. And we see that in verses 28 to 34. A gracious provision from God. Now, although Judah was not the oldest of Jacob's children, as verses 8 to 12 indicate, he is beginning to play a prominent role within the life of this family. It was Judah who guaranteed Benjamin's safety in chapter 43, and in doing so persuaded Jacob to finally let his youngest son go down to Egypt. And then it was Jacob, you may remember, who pleaded with Joseph in chapter 44, offering to stay in Egypt himself so that Benjamin could return to his father. And now it is Judah that Jacob sends on ahead in verse 28 to get directions to Goshen. It's remarkable when you think of what he did in chapter 38. But he is beginning to play a prominent role in this family. And they're traveling to Goshen because that is where Joseph said in chapter 45, verse 10, that they could stay. And sure enough, it is in Goshen that Joseph comes to be reunited with his father and the entire family. And as verse 29 indicates, it was quite a reunion. Joseph threw his arms around his father and wept for a long time. But although the reunion has taken place in Goshen, it appears that Joseph has still to get Pharaoh's permission for them to stay and settle there. And so he starts preparing them for the next challenge from verse 31 onwards. And if you look at what he's going to say to Pharaoh, and if you look at what he tells them to say to Pharaoh, you'll notice that there is a big emphasis on their occupation. There is a big emphasis on them being shepherds. And why is that the thing that Joseph is going to highlight? And why is that the thing that he wants them to highlight when asked by Pharaoh? Well, the answer is in verse 34. Then you'll be allowed to settle in the region of Goshen, for all shepherds are detestable to the Egyptians. All shepherds are detestable to the Egyptians. Now, if you can picture a map of Egypt, then Goshen was an area of land to the east of the Nile Delta. You know where the Nile comes up to the Mediterranean? The vast majority of Egypt is on this side, but there is a little bit of land on that side, and apparently Goshen was on that eastern part. Under normal conditions, it was considered to be a very fertile place, and that is why Pharaoh will describe it in the next chapter as the best part of the land. But it didn't have that advantage at this moment in time, because the entire region is in the grip of a severe famine. But the advantage that Goshen did have is that it was a remote area, well away from the main centres of Egyptian population. And since shepherds were detestable to Egyptians, Pharaoh would be quite happy for Joseph's shepherding family to settle there. There wouldn't be many Egyptians to annoy in that part of Egypt, and therefore he could accommodate them there without unsettling his own population. Pharaoh wasn't stupid in giving them Goshen, and neither was Joseph in requesting Goshen. And if I can say this reverently, neither was Joseph's God in graciously providing them with Goshen. You see, being away from the main centres of Egyptian population meant that they would be away from the bulk of Egyptian influence, including Egyptian culture and Egyptian religion. And what that meant was that this family, who, don't forget, constitute the people of God at this time, what that meant is that this family would be able to live a separate life. Although living in Egypt, they wouldn't be influenced by Egypt. And therefore they wouldn't become Egyptian in their thinking and in their values and in their worship. Although in Egypt they wouldn't be of Egypt. In that sense, Goshen was certainly a gracious provision from God. And did you know, many years later, and God still provides his people with all that is necessary for his people to live a separated life. Now, before going any further, I need to point out that separation for the people of God is not the same today as it was in Jacob's day. There is no longer a geographical separation, and therefore we are not meant to retreat into Christian ghettos, and we're not meant to all sell up and move to the Shetland Isles or somewhere remote like that. If you think of the New Testament churches that had letters sent to them, they were nearly all in big centres of population, with some of their members involved in all sorts of occupations and activities. And so, to use a well-known phrase, God expects his people today to be very much in the world, involved in its politics, involved in its culture, involved in its education system, involved in its legal system, involved in the business world. But although we are to be in the world, we are not to be of the world, in the sense that we are not to imbibe this world's wicked ethos and this world's godless mindset and this world's immoral standards. We are not to allow this world to mould our thinking, to shape our priorities, to determine our morality, or to regulate our worship. And so the big question is, and this is the big challenge that the people of God have faced throughout history, how can we be in the world but not of it? If we have not to relocate to a geographical equivalent of Goshen, then what has God given us that will enable us to live a separate life? What has God given us that will enable us to be in the world but not of it? Well, he has given us several things which will help us with that constant challenge. As we've seen already this evening, he has given us his Spirit to indwell us. He's also given us one another so that we might help and encourage one another in facing that constant challenge. But as we listen to Jesus praying for his disciples in John 17, we hear Jesus highlight something else that God has given to help us in facing that challenge. John 17, verse 14. This is what he says as he prays for his disciples. He said, I have given them your word, and the world has hated them, for they are not of the world any more than I am of the world. My prayer is not that you take them out of the world, but that you protect them from the evil one. They are not of the world, even as I am not of it. Sanctify them by the truth. Your word is truth. As you sent me into the world, I have sent them into the world. And so Jesus is making it clear that he expects his followers to be very much in the world. He explicitly says that he's not praying for them to be taken out of the world, but rather he's sending them into the world. But at the same time, he expects them to be separate from the world. That is what the word sanctify means. It means to set apart. It means to separate. And in a context which is all about followers of Jesus living in the world but not being of it, that sanctifying or separating that Jesus is referring to in John 17 would seem to be our separation from the world, our being set apart from the world. And the way in which Jesus envisages that sanctifying or separating from the world occurring in the lives of his followers was through the influence of God's word in their lives. I have given them your word, verse 14. Sanctify them by the truth, verse 17. Your word is truth. As Mr. Carson says in that verse, Jesus' followers will be set apart from the world, reserved for God's service, insofar as they think and live in conformity with the truth. And therefore, many years later, and God still makes a gracious provision for his people, which enables them to live a separate life whilst living in a fallen world. And that, says Jesus, is the provision of God's word. It is as we prayerfully read and humbly obey his word that our minds will be renewed, that our lives will be transformed, and in doing so we will no longer be conformed to the pattern of this world, to use Paul's language in Romans chapter 12. Yes, in this day God hasn't provided us with a geographical Goshen, but he has provided us, graciously provided us, with something else that enables us to live a separate life as the people of God, that enables us to be in the world and not of it. And that gracious provision is his word. Three things we see in Genesis 46. The first is a sufficient reassurance from God. The second is an important lesson from God. And the third, a gracious provision from God.